Okay, so if you're like me, you might be a natural spender. And if you're a natural spender, you may have some problems when it comes to saving money. Maybe you find that you just overspend on so many random things. Maybe you find that you're always impulse buying things, and then you might realize you don't even like the things that you bought. Maybe you tend to do some emotional spending. So if you're angry or upset, one of the first things you do is actually look online to buy something, or you hit the shops. And maybe whenever you do spend that money, you end up feeling really guilty about it because you keep telling yourself that you should have saved that money instead. And because you already feel guilty, you almost give up, and then the cycle keeps going. So because you feel guilty, you spend more money, and then because you spent that money, you feel guilty again. So if you resonate with any of those things, just know that you're not alone. I was someone who was also in that same situation. Whenever I would spend money, I would feel guilty about it. I would spend a lot of money on just random things that I didn't necessarily care about, and I really struggled to save money because of it, to the point where I actually ended up being in debt because I wasn't able to save any money. And so I ended up having a maxed out overdraft simply because I would overspend a lot, and I would also just spend money on random things. But I'm also someone who has come out the other side where, yes, I still spend money and I still enjoy spending my money actually, but I've got to the point where I'm also able to save a lot of my income consistently. So in this video, I want to outline the one thing that helped me to actually stop overspending, to the point where I ended up paying off all of my debt, and it was about 16 grand, and I paid that off in 18 months. And just over a year later, I had over 10K in savings and investments. So if you're someone who was in a similar position to where I was before, just know that it is still possible to save, and I'm gonna tell you how. Okay, so here's the one thing that helped me to stop overspending, and it is I learned how to do intentional spending. That's it. Now, before you just decide that the video is finished, I actually want to explain what I mean by intentional spending and the 3 things that you need to be thinking about if you actually want to be spending much more intentionally. So when I'm talking about intentional spending, I simply mean just having meaning behind my spending, really starting to think about my spending beyond just buying anything and everything. So one of the first things that helped me to become intentional with my spending is that I decided that I would learn how to plan my spending and my savings in advance. Now, what do I mean by this? So when it comes to overspending, many of us overspend simply because we just don't know how to plan. And if we don't know how to plan, or if we don't even plan out our money, well then you're less likely to understand where you want your money to go. And if you don't necessarily know where you want your money to go, well then what will happen is that your money will just go everywhere. So before, the reason why I was overspending all the time is because I didn't know what was coming in and I didn't know what was supposed to go out. So whenever it came to payday, I would just be spending money left, right and center, but then sometimes I would get towards the middle of the month and I would have no money left over because I had already spent it. And the reason why I did that is because I hadn't necessarily planned out how I wanted to spend the money. So because I didn't plan it out, that money just went here, there and everywhere. And so by the time it got to the end of the month, I would really be struggling and literally have pennies in my account because I had no idea where the money had gone. And so in my case, I ended up having to keep dipping into my overdraft because I didn't have enough money to pay for other things. For example, I may not have had enough money to actually pay for some of my other bills because I had already spent that money on something completely random already. And if you're liking this video so far, then feel free to give me a thumbs up, as it really does help to support the channel. Plus, it's free. So what I realized is that if I wanted to be just a bit more intentional with my spending, I needed to start planning it out. I needed to ask myself, how do I actually want to spend my money this month? Do I want to spend money on just random things that I don't care about? Or do I actually want to spend money on things that will benefit me? So I got to the point where I started planning out how much I want to spend on groceries, how much I want to spend on eating out, entertainment, if I want to buy any clothes for that month. Just simply having a plan for my spending actually helped me to start saving more money, because I then knew exactly how much I wanted to spend versus how much I would then also be able to save as well. And I know you might already be saying, but Veronia, sometimes things just come up and they're not planned for. Well, what if I told you that you could actually plan for that too? So for example, in my case, when I'm planning out my spending, I actually have a category for miscellaneous. And what that means is that I set aside money for things that could randomly come up that I haven't necessarily planned for. So if, for example, I decide to buy something, you know, randomly in the month, and I decide, actually, I really want to buy this, well, then I have some money in my miscellaneous category where I can use that money to fund that purchase. So even if there are things that aren't necessarily planned for that crop up during the week or the month, you can still plan for it. I also have clients who actually plan for impulse purchases, because you're not always going to be 100% perfect. There are going to be some things that you just want to buy on the impulse, and that's okay. But what you can do is you can actually plan for that in advance. So what my clients will do is they will set aside money for any impulse purchases, so that if they do want to make that impulse purchase, they have money sitting there. And so what that means is that they are still less likely to overspend, because they've actually planned for that. And so they are still able to save a lot more money, because they have already planned for any other spending, even if there are some impulse purchases made. Now, if you're someone who needs a bit more help when it comes to planning out your spending, I will leave a link in the description below for you if you want to check out my one-on-one money coaching. But when it comes to being intentional with your spending, one of the best ways to do that is by planning out your spending, because when you know exactly how much you want to spend, you can then also plan out your savings too. Now, the other way that intentional spending helped me to stop overspending was the idea that intentional spending helped me to save first and spend later. Now, what I mean by this is, one of the biggest mistakes we tend to make is that we prioritize spending first and then we save everything later. And usually what happens is, by the time it comes to the end of the week or the month, you probably don't have any money to save, and so you then end up being in the same position as you were before, and then you get upset telling yourself that I haven't been able to save money. Whereas when I'm actually being much more intentional with my spending, I'm actually also being intentional with the way I save as well. So for me, the saving will be priority first. And once I've prioritized that and dealt with it separately, I can then spend the rest of the money how I like. And we also have to think about our brains as well, because what I realized is that when I actually saved that money first and I put it aside and it was in a completely separate account to my spending, my brain then told me, okay, this is the amount of money I now have left to spend. I'm gonna make sure that I can work with that money. And this actually really helped me to stop feeling so guilty when I was spending my money, because I realized that the reason why I was feeling so guilty before was because I would be spending all of this money, but I'd realize that I'd have no savings, and then I'd be like, oh, I should have saved this money. Whereas because I decided to prioritize those savings first, I was then able to spend that money guilt-free, knowing that no matter what happened, even if I spent every single penny, that was okay, because I had already saved money before. So my savings were already taken care of. And so that freed me up to be able to actually spend the money that I had set aside, because I knew that at the end of the day, I had already saved money anyway. Now, you might be like, okay, Veronia, I do this already. I try to save money first, but for some reason, even if I try to save that money, I end up dipping into my savings. And so I still end up being in the same position. And if you're doing that, then it's probably because you're not actually planning for your other expenses accordingly. So if we go back to the first point, you need to also be able to have an understanding of your expenses and how you actually spend your money, so that you then don't have to dip into your savings. So for example, one of the things that I realized is that I would try and save money, but then the next month my car insurance was due. And because I hadn't prepared for my car insurance, I then had to use my savings to pay for that car insurance. And so I realized, oh, there are other things that I need to actually be planning for in advance so that I don't have to dip into my savings all the time. And so what I did is I then started creating separate pots, separate funds for these different things. And you might know them as sinking funds. So what I had to do is I had to create a separate savings pot for my car insurance. I created one for birthday presents, for Christmases, even if I was going to the dentist. The reason why I did that is because I didn't want to get to a point where I would have to then dip into my other savings just to pay for those expenses, especially when I knew that those expenses were going to come up in the future. Okay, so the other way that intentional spending helped me to actually stop overspending and save more is the fact that intentional spending allowed me to actually spend money. Now, this may sound counterintuitive because you're probably thinking, well, if I want to stop overspending, don't I just need to completely stop all of my spending? And I would say that that is probably one of the biggest mistakes people make. I think people think that in order to stop overspending, they just need to cut back on everything and they'll stop spending. When in reality, that doesn't always happen. Because typically, if you're someone who is so used to spending a lot of money, if you completely go cold turkey, it's probably not going to last very long and you may end up itching just to spend more money. And what may happen is that you spend more money than you intended to before simply because you completely cut back. And then what tends to happen is because you've now spent more money, you then feel bad, you give up and decide to spend even more money simply because you have given up. So what intentional spending actually helped me to do is realize that I can still spend money. There isn't anything wrong with spending money. However, I just need to think about the way I'm spending money. Am I actually happy with the way I'm spending money? And before, I realized that I wasn't, because I was spending money on pretty much any random thing and it just wasn't helping me. So what I did is I realized I actually need to start spending money on things that truly matter to me, things that are important to me, so that when I now spend that money, I don't feel guilty about spending the money because I know that it's going to benefit me. Whereas before, I would feel guilty about spending that money because it just wasn't benefiting me. So when I allowed myself to spend money and I just simply had a plan for it, that then gave me the freedom to realize I could still enjoy my money. I could still spend money and I could still enjoy it, knowing that I could still save money at the same time. And so what intentional spending does is it still allows you to enjoy spending your money. You don't have to completely cut back on everything, but when you're much more intentional, you now start thinking about whether that spending will help benefit you or if it's just gonna hurt you in the long run. When you actually start spending money on things that matter to you and you start planning for that in advance, that then gives you the freedom to still enjoy that money, but it doesn't have to be at a detriment to you actually saving some money as well. And because I knew that I was in control and I still had the freedom to spend, I actually stopped overspending, because then I realized, what was the point in me overspending on random things anyway? And because I wasn't overspending, I was then able to save a lot more money while still spending that money at the same time. Now, if you're someone who realizes that you really struggle when it comes to spending money, maybe you're overspending constantly and you don't really know how to control it, and it's actually stopping you from being able to save a lot more money. Maybe you've been trying to save for a house deposit and it's not working. Maybe you're trying to save up for an emergency fund and you just need a bit more support. Then definitely check out my one-on-one coaching, because what I've been able to do is help so many clients actually still save a lot more money without having to completely restrict their spending. So they're still able to have the freedom to actually spend their money at the same time as saving their money. So make sure you do check that out if you haven't already. What you can do is book a free call just to find out more about working with me. So I'll link more information up here for you and in the description below. So if you realize that you tend to overspend a lot and you want to stop doing it, just remember that you don't necessarily have to completely cut back on everything. By being so much more intentional with your spending, you may realize that you're still able to save a lot more money whilst at the same time still having the freedom to spend that money too. So if you did like this video, then please do give me a thumbs up if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on intentional spending? I do post every Tuesday, so if you would like to know more, then of course you can subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next week.